Good morning. I want to thank you, Paulette, for those kind words. And actually, I talked to Reverend Sharpton yesterday, and it was actually hundreds of thousands of people. It wasn't not merely tens of thousands. It's a pleasure to join so many good friends and administration colleagues in welcoming you all here this morning. You all are a distinguished group of civil rights advocates, private sector partners, and community development professionals, and we're glad to have you all here at the White House. It's a privilege for me to have the opportunity to help kick off what I'm sure is going to be a productive and inspiring forum. Now, I think it's really fitting that we come together in this week as our nation marks the 50th anniversary on the March on Washington, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stood before 250,000 Americans, hundreds of thousands, on the National Mall and shared his dream with the world and called on his fellow citizens in the pursuit of an ideal that has defined this country since its earliest days, and that is that all are created equal. Now, I think that despite the remarkable and I think once almost unimaginable progress that we've made over the last 50 years, and that so many of you have helped to make possible since that moment, in expanding economic opportunity and moving toward racial equality and in overturning legal discrimination, I think that the unfortunate reality is that even today, 50 years after the march, 150 years after emancipation, our long struggle to overcome disparities, to bridge long-standing divisions, and to eradicate violence has not yet ended. And we must seize the opportunity. And I think we have to seize this opportunity here, and we have to seize this opportunity now to recommit ourselves to Dr. King's unfinished work, to reclaim his singular vision of what this nation stands for and what it can become, and to keep advancing his dream of a society that delivers on the promise of equal justice for all. As community and as business leaders, as passionate activists, and as concerned citizens, I know that all of you are really working hard to confront indefensible conditions and inequities. You're calling every American to examine our values and to examine our priorities. You're challenging our great nation to aim higher and to become better. And I want to assure you and the communities that you serve that I'm proud to stand with you in advancing this work. The President is proud to stand with you, and today's Justice Department has never been really more committed to meeting the goals and the responsibilities that I think that we all share. Now, this commitment from the Justice Department is evident in the record of progress that we've established, I think, over the last 4.5 years, and the aggressive, effective steps that we're taking at the Department each and every day to honor our founding principles. Now, I'm pleased to report that despite the challenges that the Civil Rights Division is facing, we're continuing to make great strides in enforcing many of the key safeguards that Dr. King and so many others fought to secure. And nowhere is this clearer than in our work to protect the voting rights of every eligible American and to ensure that the Supreme Court's recent decision cannot be interpreted as an open season for states to pursue measures that result in voter suppression. Just last week, the Department filed suit against the state of Texas over its strict voter identification law, and last week we joined ongoing litigation over the state's 2011 redistricting plans. Due to a history of intentional discrimination, we have asked the federal courts that are presiding over both cases to require Texas to submit all voting changes to a pre-clearance regime that is very similar to the one that is required by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, these actions represent the Department's latest steps to protect voting rights following the Supreme Court's flawed ruling, but they will not be our last. My colleagues and I are determined to use every tool that remains at our disposal to stand against discrimination wherever it is found. We cannot and we will not allow the slow unraveling of the progress that so many throughout history have sacrificed so much to achieve. That simply will not happen as long as I am the Attorney General. And in our broader efforts, we will continue to look far beyond America's ballot boxes to our schools, to our military bases, to our border areas, to our immigrant communities, our workplaces, and our criminal justice system as well, in order to advance the fight for equality and against injustice. Now, as it stands, a vicious cycle of poverty, of criminality, and of incarceration traps too many Americans and weakens too many communities. It's become clear that 20th century criminal justice solutions are not adequate to overcome our 21st century challenges. Too many people go to too many prisons for far too long and for no truly good law enforcement reason. And it's well past time to consider a fundamentally new approach. That's why at the beginning of this year, I launched a targeted Justice Department review of the federal criminal justice system to identify obstacles, inefficiencies, and inequities, and to examine ways to strengthen the system as a whole. And earlier this month in San Francisco at the ABA convention, I announced the results of that review, which include a series of what I think are really significant reforms that will ensure that we become smarter on crime, that we help to enhance the use of diversion programs as an effective effective alternative to incarceration, and alter our charging policies with respect to certain drug-related crimes so that people convicted of low-level, nonviolent drug offenses will face sentences that are suited to their individual conduct rather than draconian mandatory minimums that are more appropriate for violent criminals and for drug kingpins. Now, the department is taking these steps because in this and many other ways, both large and small, we as a country, we have to do better. We've seen all too clearly that we simply cannot prosecute, we simply cannot incarcerate our way to becoming a safer nation. To be effective, federal efforts also must focus on prevention and also on reentry. We must never stop being tough on crime, but we also must be smart and efficient when battling crime, but also battling the conditions and the individual choices that tend to breed crime. It's not a coincidence that you see the greatest amount of violent crime where you see the greatest amount of social dysfunction. And if we want to be smart on dealing with criminal matters, we have to deal with those conditions that breed crime. Ultimately, this is about much more than fairness for those who become involved in our criminal justice system, though that is a guide for us. It's a matter of public safety. It's also a matter of public good. It makes plain economic sense. It's about who we are as a people, and it has the potential to, I think, positively impact the lives of every man, woman, and child in every city, in every neighborhood in the United States. By staying true to the values that we share, I am confident in our ability to protect the safety of our fellow citizens and to ensure justice in our communities. I'm optimistic about where our joint efforts will lead us in this regard, but I also recognize, as I'm sure that you do, that the Justice Department will never be able to secure the results that we need and the progress that our citizens deserve on its own. And that's why events like this one are really so important, because improving the world around us and strengthening this great nation is a responsibility that is shared by all of us. In the months and the years ahead, as we implement the changes that I've announced, and we will discuss additional reforms and fight to preserve and expand access to the ballot box for every American, my colleagues and I will continue to rely on your expertise, your dedication, as well as your partnership. Now, I know, and I'm sure that you know, this is not always going to be easy. But if we remain committed to working together in common cause and in good faith and with mutual respect, if we stay true to the legacy of the civil rights pioneers on whose shoulders we all stand, and if we resolve to keep moving forward, despite every inevitable setback and through every obstacle, I'm sure that the future that Dr. King imagined is within our reach. His vision will not elude our grasp, and his dream will someday lead us to walk together into the promised land. And in that regard, I look forward to working with each and every one of you on all the things that we must confront, especially members of Congress who had the good fortune of working with over the last 4.5 years, and with so many of you who are familiar to me, who I've known for a variety of years in a variety of contexts. We can get this done. We can make this a better nation. We can make this a more fair nation. But again, as I said, it's not going to be easy. There are going to be setbacks. There's going to be opposition. Some of that opposition will be principled with regard to some of the policy choices that we make. Some of it will be reactionary. We have to understand that as well. But if we stay together, if we work together, if we remain focused on, keep our eyes on the prize, we can make this nation better than we found it, and especially in this year, with all these anniversaries that we have from 1963. We can make this a truly wonderful celebration of what happened in that year, the great things that happened that year, the progress that was made during that time. And as I said, I look forward to working with all of you in that regard. So enjoy the day. I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity for people to interact and talk about how we might do all the things that we need to do. And I hope that you will see, as a result of the events of today, that this administration, this president, is committed to making sure that we hear you, that we work with you, and as I said, that we make this country all that it possibly can be. So again, thanks very much for being here.
All right. Hello. Tall chair here.
Backstage saying, oh, no, look at those high chairs.
Okay, they're unforgiving, but we're going to make it. We're troopers. We're going to soldier on. I want to start off by, first of all, thanking all of you for being here, and obviously thank you so much to Valerie Jarrett for giving up your time to do this. This is an important discussion and an historic time to have it. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Congressman Stephen Horsford, who's here. If you could please stand, and he's a Democratic member from Nevada's 4th Congressional District. Good to kind of you to be here today. So obviously, we are here on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, a momentous and historic occasion. So I am going to lob a hardball question to start off, and it's broad, but it's fairly obvious. What does it mean, 50 years on from the March on Washington, to have an African-American president in the White House?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. We are thrilled to have you here. We have been planning the events of this week for a very long time, and to see them all come to fruition is just tremendous. And I'd like to thank my team, who I know has been working day and night, including the time when I snuck away for a vacation. So a huge shout out to them, and thank you, Joy, for doing this. So I think what it shows is progress. We have made a great deal of progress over the last 50 years. Towards equality, but we also know that just simply having a black president doesn't suddenly change everything for many people who are still facing disparities around our country. And one of the real motivations for the president, beginning at the very beginning of his professional career, when he was a community organizer on the south side of Chicago, helping people who had lost their jobs when the steel mills closed, helping people register to vote, was this sense of, in this land of great opportunity, we need to make sure that regardless of your zip code, all of our children have that opportunity for the American dream. And so I think this occasion gives us a chance to think back. 50 years ago, I was just a very, very small child at the time, barely born. But remember the energy that surrounded the occasion, and remember watching on television with my parents and just being so amazed that ordinary people from all across our country showed up and chose to get involved, chose to be engaged, chose to let their voices be heard. And we all know that that's how change happens. And so congratulations to those who organized the march last Saturday. It was a terrific turnout, and I know that the president is looking forward to having a chance to address our nation tomorrow.
And you talk about economic progress. I mean, people do forget, they leave off sometimes the part about jobs and opportunity when they talk about the March on Washington. But it was a lot about, you talk about ladders of opportunity, it was about creating a dignified opportunity for people to work, to have a meaningful life. And yet we still see these disparities. We still see African Americans' unemployment rate double that of their white fellow Americans. We still see people who have not been able to dig back out of the Great Recession of 2008, which really wiped out a lot of the progress that had been made for minorities, for African Americans, for people of all races who find themselves in poverty. How do we build a sustainable middle-class opportunity for all Americans?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one that those of you who've been listening to President Obama, particularly over the last few weeks as he's been traveling around the country, trying to get Washington to wake up and remember why they're here, and what we're here to do is to serve people all across the country. And what he's been saying is, look, what people want all over our country, regardless of race, regardless of income, regardless of any way you could segment the population, people all want the same thing. They want to work hard. They want to get a good education. They want to be able to have a job that can take care of their family, buy a home, send their children to school so that the next generation continues to do better than the generation before, which is part of what has always made our country strong. They don't want to have to worry about going broke if they get sick or they're in an accident. And at the end of a career, they want to be able to retire with dignity and a little money in their pocket. And that, in a sense, is the American dream that is out of reach for too many people. And so what the president has been talking about is how do we make sure that everybody has that opportunity? And it begins, of course, with early childhood education. And I say that with a smile because I just got off the phone with my mom, who's spent her entire career focusing on early childhood education and making it a profession, because obviously the earlier we start to educate our children with quality pre-K, the better off they're going to be down the line. Our data shows that for every dollar you spend on pre-K saves you 7 other dollars down the line. So you can make an economic case for it, but it's also, don't all of our children deserve to get off on the right path? So education is the pathway, we know, out of poverty and up the ladder, and we have to continue that to make sure that our elementary schools and our secondary schools, high schools are good. And then we need to make college affordable, and the president has made an enormous amount of progress to try to expand that opportunity for young people so that they can go to college and get a good education, and that's the beginning of it. We have been talking a lot recently about the Affordable Care Act, which I would note on October 1st, those who do not currently have health care have an opportunity to enroll and receive health care. And one of the major barriers towards being productive in the workplace and taking care of your family is if you get sick. And I love particularly the benefits for women, because so often women don't get the kind of care that they need on an ongoing basis, so preventive care. And so now, and we know, moms in the audience, you always choose yourself last. If it's a choice between putting food on the table or paying rent or buying school books, it's back to school time for our children, the last thing that you do is think about your own health care. But we also know that mothers are the backbone of the family, and if they're not well, then the entire family suffers. And so now, under the Affordable Care Act, preventive services are available without a copay, so you don't have to choose between how you're spending your money, as well as a range of other services to make it affordable for everyone. So it all ties together. And so I think, in a sense, 50 years after that iconic march, we have the opportunity to take stock and be honest with ourselves. Where have we made progress, and where is there still work to go, and what responsibility do we each have to accept for being a part of that solution? And so I think that's a piece of what you'll hear from the president tomorrow.
We talk about, you're talking about health care. I mean, 50 years since the March on Washington, it's been about 100 years of presidents, various presidents trying to pass universal health care. Now that it is passed, now that it has gone through the Supreme Court, it is settled law, have you been surprised, and have members of the administration been surprised by the vigorousness of the continuing vigorousness of the opposition to the Affordable Care Act?
I see you just shaking your head. That's how I feel. That is just how I feel. You know what? After 4.5 years of living in Washington, nothing really surprises me. But I think it's going to be quite telling, because now you're not talking about kind of a piece of legislation. Now you're talking about people's lives. And so, for example, to those who have children who aren't yet 26, who get to stay on their parents' insurance, you're talking about throwing those kids off the insurance and leaving them uninsured. To our senior citizens who've been getting help with their prescription drugs, you're talking about taking away that subsidy so that their drugs are not so affordable. And we know so many senior citizens, cut their medication in half, or they don't get it filled on a regular basis. Well, we need to make sure that we're taking care of our senior citizens. To all of the women who would be getting those preventive services I mentioned a moment ago without a copay, so you're going to start charging them again. Or children with pre-existing conditions who are often uninsured because their insurance companies were discriminating against children and adults who have pre-existing conditions. And I have met so many parents over the last several years who say to me, do you realize that because of the Affordable Care Act, my child is now going to be able to get treatment? If you are a parent and your child is sick, you should not have to worry about whether or not they get the kind of treatment that they so deserve. Not in a country as wealthy as this. And to the millions and millions of people who currently don't have insurance, who will be able to enroll again on October 1st, you're going to take that away from them. And so I think the people who are running these commercials that you're seeing now on television, and I thought there was a great commercial earlier today, or a great response to a commercial that was criticizing one of the Republicans who wasn't fighting hard enough to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, and the Republican tweeted out, whatever. And I thought that was like the perfect response. I'm like, come on. When you think of the hard work that should be before Congress right now, the fact that the House of Representatives has had, I think it's now 40 votes to try to repeal the act, when they know it can't pass the Senate, just imagine what they could get done if they were working on the people's business during that period of time.
And one other piece of business now before the Congress, because of the Supreme Court and their decision on Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Talk about the White House view of that, of the setback really for voting rights. Again, very ironic, 50 years after the March on Washington. But do you see a path to the Congress actually remedying this?
Well, we think so, and I know that the Attorney General is working very hard on trying to create an atmosphere where we can get a bipartisan piece of legislation supported. Historically, the Voting Rights Act has been continuously reauthorized with oftentimes unanimous votes, and so I think that we are optimistic that we can get legislation, but I also think it's an opportunity to, number one, remind ourselves that we still all have the right to vote. And no one can take that away from you. And if they try to make it harder to vote, then it means that we have to work just that much harder to make sure everyone has access to vote. The President was just saying yesterday when he met with a group of pastors who were here visiting the White House, just look what happened in the last election when people stood in line hour after hour after hour. And it's in a sense that determination in the face of difficulty is really what engagement, again, is all about. And so just because we lost a case and it's a setback doesn't mean that we cannot use other efforts to make sure that people have that right to exercise. And the Attorney General has made it clear that he's going to be diligent about pursuing and protecting that right and bring lawsuits when he deems it appropriate to do so. And so we will do everything through the Justice Department to try to guarantee everybody has that right to vote. But we also have a responsibility to remember that so many people sacrificed, people died, and so that we would all have that right to vote. And so even if it's a little harder, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And there should be 100% voter turnout on every possible election, because that's how, again, we exercise our obligation for civic participation.
And now, when the President first came into office, one of the first things he signed was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, talking about fair pay. And when you talk about civil rights, you talk about advancements for so many groups, the LGBT community, what the President did in the Lilly Ledbetter Act. Talk about the role of women's rights as it relates to civil rights.
Well, it's extremely important. And I think one of the things that was very heartening as we listened to the speeches over the weekend is how inclusive the definition of civil rights was for many of the speakers. So rights for the LGBT community, as you said, Joy, rights for women. Women still only earn 77 cents on the dollar, less for women of color. And how could that be in 2013? And what more can we do to protect a woman's right for equal pay? And Lilly Ledbetter was an important decision, but we've also promoted an additional piece of legislation, the Equal Paycheck Fairness Act, and that would add additional tools for women to ensure that they have equal pay, and that has been blocked in Congress. And so we need everyone to really focus on these issues as well. We're going to do everything we can through the executive branch of government, but we really need Congress to act. And I think that when half of your population is working, women, and more households are either headed by women or you have two working parents, two working adults, that income is not just a women's issue anymore. That's a family issue, it's a societal issue, it's a community issue, and it's part of how we make sure our economy stays strong. So yes, we need to be very inclusive when we're talking about civil rights, and keep in mind, and as the President says really very well, no matter where you come from, no matter what your last name, no matter what your zip code, who raised you, who you love, whether you have a disability, you should have that opportunity to work and be productive, and that includes equality on all levels, equal pay, and additional benefits that make our backbone of our country stronger.
And I want to bring it back to, you talked about some of the long-term solutions to try to get those ladders of opportunity, particularly given the disparities in terms of minority groups, in terms of women, in terms of pay. What immediate remedies are available from a policy standpoint? Let's say we're putting in place the education long-term, we're putting in place health-term long-term. But for people who are suffering in the short term, what are some immediate remedies that the White House is thinking about in terms of implementing them that can get through Congress, hopefully?
Well, many of them we already have passed. And if you think back to the initial Recovery Act that the president passed right after the election, and just remember back, we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. We had, in the last 6 months of the prior administration, we lost 4 million jobs in this country. And we know that particularly in communities of color, there were disparities long before the latest setback in the economy. And yet now, over the last 40 months, we've had consecutive private sector job creation. Over 7.2 million jobs have been created. But in that Recovery Act, we put in very important provisions to make sure that taxes on 98% of Americans did not go up, and making sure that we extend the child care tax credit, the college affordability tax credit, the earned income tax credit. These are all programs that are intended to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable have a little extra money in their pocket. And the president has been very vigorous, including at the end of last year, to make sure that taxes for the vast majority of Americans don't go up. And what he fought very hard for in that last election was a difference of strategy. There's one that says, look, if we protect the taxes of those at the very rich, at the very top, then somehow that's going to trickle on down and benefit everybody else. Well, we've actually tried that strategy before, and it didn't work. And what the president said is, I want to build the middle class from the middle out. And I want to provide those important ladders of opportunity for those who want to work and get into the middle class. And so making sure that we keep our taxes low gives you that little extra money in the pocket. Extending unemployment insurance. We know so many people who lost their jobs during this last recession need to have that unemployment insurance to make ends meet. And they will go out and spend that money right away, providing for their families, and that also helps to get the economy going again. And so throughout the last 4.5 years, the president has taken immediate steps, medium-term steps, and long-term steps, all designed to make sure that we have an economy that's here to last, that's sustainable, that doesn't depend on bubbles, that doesn't depend on false economy, but really builds. And you have to have the patience to have the long-term strategy while you're also helping people who are immediately in need. I say we've been joined by our Secretary of HUD. Stand up, Sean. Say hello to everybody. Sean Donovan's here. Making sure that we have affordable homes for people so that they also have that ability. Everyone in our country deserves a home. So many people lost their homes as a result of the last recession, and the Secretary and his agency has worked very, very hard to ensure that we are able to keep people in their homes for, so that's not one more worry that they have as a concern.
Now, I want to remind you, as we are going to take questions from the audience, if you can start thinking of your question now. Start thinking about it. We're going to have a mic start to go around and get a couple questions from the audience. But
maybe someone from Twitter,
and
too,
from Twitter,
right?
if we can get a signal in here. We're struggling with trying to get a signal. But we're going to try to also get some questions from social media, from Facebook and Twitter. But, I feel like I have to ask this question. It is 50th anniversary. We're talking about sort of the big picture on where we've come in terms of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, about his 4 little children being able to join hands in brotherhood. And yet, there's been this tremendous backlash each time that President Obama has touched the issue of race. Whether it was Henry Louis Gates, being arrested trying to go into his own home, and that's somebody he knew, or talking about his commonality with Trayvon Martin, a dead teenager in Florida. There's just this tremendous blowback that happens whenever he addresses the issue. Is it even possible to have a conversation about race when the first African-American president gets so much backlash just for touching the issue?
Well, I always look at the glass as half full. And so, yes, there often is backlash, no matter who talks about the issue. But I also think what I heard in his recent conversation is people who were actually having safe conversations at work and around their kitchen tables and saying, yes, that has happened to me. And I've had people who said, oh my gosh, that's actually happened. And so conversations sometimes are difficult, but I think we have to find ways of having them where they're safe. And I think that the president can't worry about a backlash if he thinks that he can add value. And I think when he spoke after Trayvon Martin's, the verdict in the Zimmerman case, he was trying to provide value. He was trying to provide a perspective. I mean, just think about it. There had been demonstrations, mostly very peaceful around our country. It was the day before. There were 100 demonstrations that were planned all around the country. And he wanted to provide a better understanding as to why people were so frustrated and so angry, and that it wasn't just simply about this devastating young loss of this young person's life, but it was about a history of experience. And so I think you keep trying, and you can't let the fear of some people trying to use it as an opportunity, because let's face it, they'll find something to attack the president about every single day. So that can't get in the way. I think you just have to be honest and straightforward and try to enhance people's understandings. And we have made a lot of progress. I mean, we talk about this next generation of young people, and they are better. They are more tolerant. They are more accepting of each other's diversities than my generation or my parents or my grandparents. And so I think the optimistic side is that we do get better with each generation, but those of us who are adults have a responsibility to try to help our children understand that our country will simply be better off. It will be that more perfect union. We will bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice if we are all pushing together. And that can happen through conversation. It can happen through policies. It can happen through legislation. But it happens best, and this is really my recurrent theme, when everybody gets involved and engaged. Now, looking around this terrific audience we have right here, it's diverse, all ages, all races, I'm sure, different religions. But yet you've all come together to celebrate this moment. And I think that all over our country, and we're streaming this over the internet because we want to make it available to as many as possible, these conversations are going on. And so we should take this 50th anniversary and honor King's legacy by continuing to decide what each one of us can do, both individually and collectively, to, again, work towards equality and justice.
Okay. Do we have questions from the audience? While people are
It
gathering.
doesn't look like a shy crowd.
I know. I think we have a question right here.
And if you could introduce yourself to us, please.
Thank you. Stand. We're just going to put lots of pressure on you. But we want Twitter and Facebook to see it. Oh, but yeah.
Fredette West, African American Health Alliance and Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities Coalition. Could you talk a little bit about jobs along the lines of the president calling in the big businesses that you all know that are sitting on profits and that are not hiring, and at least in a way that holds them accountable, or even when the president uses that calling them out type of approach, so that even the public will know, at least if they're not hiring, stop buying from them. But some kind of way that puts the public back in the driver's seat. Because Monday morning is all about going to work, even if you hate your job.
But we all love our jobs.
I was going to say, well, I think to your point, early on, and listen, it was controversial, but the president took some very bold steps to make sure that legislation, Dodd-Frank legislation, was passed. It puts rules of the road in place so that banks can no longer take the kind of risk that they took, where they basically took risk with the taxpayer having to foot the bill. Now, we're fortunate that they paid most of that money back, but we should never have to use taxpayer money to protect the risks that people take. And so we did pass legislation that puts rules of the road in place to make sure that that kind of risk doesn't happen again. In terms of the private sector, part of what happened when we had such a sudden economic crisis is it shocked confidence. And we're beginning to see confidence build back up again. It's been slow, but we've been, as I mentioned earlier, these 40-plus months of private sector job growth, we're moving in the right direction. But what we need to do is to make sure that we have that steady footing, because people are still cautious about spending. As they spend and as there is more demand for goods and services, those businesses will start, hopefully, to hire back in the United States. We are looking at tax policies that we could put in place that would create an incentive to bring jobs back to the United States. In last year's State of the Union address, the President highlighted how important it is to have manufacturing back in the United States. And we lost a lot of jobs to overseas for a variety of reasons, but many of those companies, I'd be heartened to add, are now moving back, and they are reinvesting back in the United States. This fall, we're going to have a big symposium here with companies from all over the world, encouraging them to invest in the United States, because this is still the best place in the world to do business, and I've heard that all over the world. We need to create incentives for them to invest right here at home. And I think we also have to look at businesses as a part of the solution. And to the degree that we can work with them in partnership and hear suggestions they have for how to make the United States competitive. I mean, I'll give you one example where we have a weakness right now is in infrastructure. And the President has been talking about infrastructure for a very long time. And if you talk to companies and they're trying to decide where do they want to locate, having an airport system that works is really important. And if you look at we saw a report recently, if you look at the top airports around the world, the United States isn't in the top 25. We need to rebuild our infrastructure. The President was just down in Jacksonville, Florida a few weeks ago, highlighting a port where we had streamlined the process to permit the port so that it could get rebuilt, because it's going to be a gateway for goods and services to come, goods, not services, goods to come in and out of the United States. And we did that through the executive branch, but we need Congress to work with us so that we can have, wireless all over our country, broadband all over our country, make sure that all of our children have access to that. And through the President's Educate Connect program, we're going to be able to increase that broadband connection, but figuring out ways where our roads, our bridges, our waterways, our infrastructure, our airports, our ports, all of them are at a high standard, will also create incentives to bring companies back here to the United States. And the President does talk about the difference between the increase in pay of the average worker versus the pay of our highly compensated CEOs. And we need for them to understand that everybody needs to have a good pay, which is why the President supported an increase in the minimum wage. And that's something that we are still working very, very hard to get. And as we increase the minimum wage, our country will be stronger. Long answer, sorry.
That's okay. I think right here.
My name is Brandy Richard. I'm the president of the National Urban League Young Professionals. I'm very honored to be here today. I think one of the issues that I hear from my demographic, 21 to 40, is, especially African Americans, is that we aren't necessarily seen as on equal footing with everyone else. So we're doing the work. We're going to college. We're getting the jobs. We're being productive members of our society, and we still don't feel like we're being treated equally. And so the death of Trayvon Martin and a lot of these things that have happened have kind of blown that out for us to see. And I think it impacts all of the discussions that we had earlier about jobs and education and all of those things. So are there conversations that we can have maybe within our communities across diverse backgrounds to be able to just talk about, hey, I'm a person too. Like, can we start there?
Well, the fact that you have the position that you do have is a good indication of where the conversation should happen, I believe. The Urban League is the perfect vehicle for these conversations around the country. And what's great about the Urban League, and I knew the Urban League in Chicago very closely when I was there, and obviously Mark Morial has been a great partner for us here, is that you're on the ground and you have the involvement of the business community and the community organizations and the religious institutions and the community organizers. It's a great diversity of interests that can come together and have that conversation. So you're not just talking to yourselves, but you're talking to the employers as well. And I think that that's really where change happens. Change happens on the ground. It happens when ordinary people come together to do extraordinary things. And I think having young people engaged in the Urban League, again, is a part of the solution. I remember the day after the election, you all may have seen the president on television talking to his campaign workers. And he said, you all are so much better than we. so much better. And that's what I would say to you. So in a sense, we're counting on you. We're counting on the young members of the Urban League, the young members of the NAACP, young members of all of the organizations around our country to pick up the baton. And you are never too young to do that. We're having a bunch of very young people here later today. I'm showing a movie to them to help inspire them. And the First Lady went to Whitney Young High School. And so the movie's about Whitney Young and his efforts. And so our goal there is to educate young people and help them understand what people did who came before them, but not so that they just simply say thank you. But part of thank you is, and what more can I do? And so we're counting on you.
Now, you mentioned wireless and the whole internet world. Do we maybe have a question from Facebook or Twitter?
Actually, I do actually have
we
a
do? Okay.
question that was sent
Coming in over your
Here we go.
BlackBerry. All right.
Yes, this was sent over from Kevin Lewis, our Director of African American Media. And the question is, do you think that President Obama will be in a better position to address and affect issues specific to African American communities when he is out of office? Has he shared any of these plans with you? And this is from Facebook user Joanna Benna.
Well, you know what? It reminds me about how the day after the election, people started talking about the 2016 race. And I was like, wait a minute.
Do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
I said, we still have a long, long way to go. And so I think that the good thing about being such a young president is that both he and the First Lady have an entire career ahead of them to do good. And I know one thing that they are both interested in is touching young people. And both of them, when you see them in a crowd of young people, they are totally inspirational, and they know that they are role models and have a certain responsibility, but they also know that they can motivate young people. And so I'm sure that anything that both of them do after they leave here will be, a part of that will be working with young folks, but he can still do that while he's in office. I don't think he has to wait another 3.5 years before he can help our young people. I think, and I say this often, just in terms of talking about our accomplishments over the last 50 years, having a president who's African American, I think is great for children of all colors. I mean, I like the... So, yes, it is absolutely true that little black girls and little black boys will look at the president and First Lady and say, maybe that's a possibility for me. But I also like the fact that my grandchildren, who I don't have yet, but my daughter just got married, so who knows, sometime in the near future, perhaps. But I like the fact that they will be born in a world where they think it's just perfectly normal. And Madeleine Albright used to joke about the fact that her grandchildren said to her, is it possible for a man to be Secretary of State? Because all they had known were women who were Secretaries of State. And so that's progress, too. And that's why each generation, you know, they come into the world and they think, well, of course you can have an African American who's president of the United States.
John Kerry is a trailblazer. He broke the glass
Kerry
ceiling.
is a trail. He's breaking the glass ceiling.
He's breaking the glass ceiling. Do we have a question? Let's get a man in. I mean, this has been girl power. We've had 3 questions from the ladies. Any more? Let's get one on this side.
Thank you. Damon Hewitt, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thank you for all the work that you've done in your office, Domestic Policy Council, Secretary Donovan, who helped us settle a huge case after Hurricane Katrina to bring housing opportunity to people in New Orleans. So I'm a native of New Orleans. Ran a project in the city after Hurricane Katrina for LDF. And, you know, we're about to mark the 8th anniversary of the horrific storm and the aftermath. And I was wondering if you can talk about, you know, the images we saw, and people who we know who lived through it all were just basically horrified by what happened. And there was a commitment from a prior administration to never let something like that happen again. This administrator has started to make true on their promise. So if you could just talk to the investments in infrastructure and also speak just to what we need to do to make sure that whether it's a hurricane, a tornado, any type of disaster like that, man-made or not, that we're ready as a country and that the least of us, or those who are treated like the least, don't suffer so greatly like they did during Hurricane Katrina.
Well, it's a very good question. And in fact, your mayor is here today. He's coming in for a meeting with a group of other mayors to talk to the president about youth violence and what we can do to combat that. And And that is in the same theme of what can we do to make sure that all of our communities are healthy and that nobody gets left behind. And as we have had national disasters, whether they've been fires or whether they have been hurricanes or tornadoes, since President Obama has been in office, you have seen a continuous improvement in our ability as we reinvest to make sure that we're doing it in a way that hardens the community and the infrastructure so that it is more able to withstand those extraordinary weather conditions in the future. So that we're not just rebuilding as is, but we are rebuilding stronger communities. And we have been very, very vigilant. The agency that oversees all of our post-hurricane, post-tornado, post any of these natural disasters is at the top of its game. And I have been out there with Craig Fugate and seen what he has done on the ground through his team of efforts. And it's always a work in progress. After the storms that we had in New Jersey and New York, we had a meeting with all of the utility CEOs. We had about, 40 utility CEOs who flew in for a meeting that the president attended, but also all of his agencies, to say, well, what did we learn from that response that will improve the next one? And I think what we have to always be willing to do is be honest and say, this is what worked well, this is what didn't work so well, and this is how we can improve so that that never, ever happens again. But thank you for mentioning it.
I think we have time for one more. Let's bounce back over to the side.
We could do this all day.
Thank you. Barbara Goldberg-Goldman with the Affordable Housing Conference of Montgomery County. And while affordable housing is first and foremost on my mind, I'm going to wait for Secretary Donovan to talk. I'd like you to address the immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform. The diversity in this country is what makes us so rich. Would you please tell us about what's being done and how we can help you?
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for your leadership on a range of issues. I know just how passionately you care. So immigration reform is a top priority for President Obama. We worked on it hard in the first term, and we were not successful. Things have changed in the second term. We were very heartened to see a comprehensive immigration bill voted out of the Senate, and we're going to continue to put pressure on encouraging the House to understand how important it would be for them to respond as well. And again, it gets back to civil rights. We talked about women, we talked about people from the LGBT community, we talked about people of different colors, and making sure that this is still a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants is extremely important to the health of our country. People look, again, at our country from the world over as that land of opportunity, and we need to make sure that those who came here illegally get right with the law, pay back taxes, and have a path to citizenship. And it will make us stronger. I mean, our economists have done models that show how it will strengthen our economy to bring folks out of the shadows, make sure that we hold employers accountable who have been paying them far below the minimum wage and taking advantage of workers, and get them back on the tax doles and make sure that they get to be full participants in our society, and that is good for our country. And so you'll be hearing a lot more about immigration reform as we have continued to amp this up over the course of the second term. And we are confident that with everybody making it a priority, it will in fact pass and we will sign it into law. And it will be a landmark piece of legislation together with the Affordable Care Act, two major pieces of legislation that when we look back 50 years from now, I think we will all be just extremely proud.
Okay, now as we draw to a close, mindful of the time, I want to throw in one more question. I want to ask a Valerie Jarrett question. I'm going to put you on. Now,
we are out of time.
and we wrap. Well, you know, and I want to ask this because, I mean, having such a senior position in any administration for a black woman would be a tremendous achievement and something, obviously, that would make you very proud. But you have this position in the White House of the first black president. So I want to ask you just on a personal level, you've known the Obamas, obviously, for a very long time. What has been sort of the most profound, what has been the biggest moment for you in the time that you've spent here working in the White House?
Each and every day. I'm telling you, every day. I'll close with one of my favorite stories, but every single day when I come through the gates of the White House, I think about the same man. I know my team is thinking, is she going to actually tell that story yet again? But it's my favorite story, so I'm going to tell you. So during the 2008 campaign, we were in Texas, and I met this gentleman who I have never forgotten, and he was an elevator operator. I shouldn't say he was the elevator operator. He was operating the elevator in a hotel where the president was staying in Austin, Texas. And we were there for about 3 days, and he took us up and down each day. And on the last day, we were leaving around 7:30 in the morning, and don't tell the president I said this, but he's actually not a morning person, so he's not really an early riser, and this was really early. And he had a cold, and we were all exhausted. And so we get into this elevator, and this gentleman says to the president, "Excuse me, sir." And I thought, oh, we're going to have a conversation now, not such a good idea. And he said, "I want to give you something." And he gives the president a patch from his uniform, military uniform. And the president realizes what it is, and he says, "Oh, I can't possibly accept it." And they go back and forth, and the gentleman insists, and back and forth. And then finally, the gentleman says, "I've carried this with me every day for 40 years. And it's kept me strong. It's given me courage. It's been an inspiration. And you have a tough road ahead." Yes, indeed. "And I want you to have it. It's just something small that I can do for you." Well, I burst into tears, as you can imagine. And I don't mean burst into tears. And never forgot him. And I asked the president later that day, I said, "What did you do with that? You know, he gave you that piece of his soul." And he said, "I put it in my pocket." And I said, "Yeah, typical man. I don't mean what did you do with it physically. I mean, how did it make you feel that he gave this to you?" Yeah, but sadly, he got the last word, which is like, so he says, "No, Valerie," and then I put it in my pocket. And he proceeds to pull out of his pocket about 10 or 12 different trinkets, and he puts them on the counter, and he proceeds to tell me the story behind each one, and who had given it to him, what their name was, why it was so special, the circumstances around the gift, and why it meant enough for him to put it in his pocket and keep it there. So yeah, he got the last laugh on that one. So anyway, I never forgot this man. And so first day I came through the gates of the White House, and every single day since then, I pause as we come through the gates, and I look at the Washington Monument, and it blinks these red lights, and I think about him, and I think, never forget that he represents what I think is just like good about our society. He sacrificed and served our country. He worked hard, and he was willing to give up his most precious possession to a stranger in the hopes that that could give that person some strength. And so I would say to myself, just do something to make him proud of you this day. And so that's what kind of keeps me going. And he is just a symbol for so many people around our country who just work so hard, and all they want from government is just a little bit of a break and make their road just a little bit easier. And I told this story to a reporter who works for the Washington Post, and right around the last election, she called me and she said, "I remember you told me that story 4 years ago. What's that guy's name?" And I said, "I never knew his name." And so she said, "Well, I'd like to find him." And I thought, oh no, what if he turns out to be like a mass murderer or something? And I've been having this fantasy every day about a guy, and I made up a story about his life and his children, and what if it's all wrong? Well, she tracked him down, and she sent me an email over the holidays at the end of last year with his name and his email. And so I wrote him an email. His name is Earl Smith. And I wrote him this long email, and I told him how I think about him every day. And he's married, it turns out. But anyway, we invited him. The president invited him to the inauguration. And he came to the White House the day after the inauguration. And he walked into the Oval Office, and he saluted the president. And I burst into tears all over again. But so there isn't any one moment. But it's people like Earl Smith that I have had the privilege of meeting every single day. And that's who gets us up to want to do the very best each and every day, that we have the privilege of serving this president and this great country. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valerie Jarrett. Thank you. I think we're all going to think about Earl every day now. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time.